Thank you very much for having me here. I'm the director of the Animal Welfare Division. I've been with the AVMA 10 years and 2 months from now. We just released the AVMA's guidelines for the depopulation of animals on April 1st. So these are our brand new guidance document, and they're going to be my primary focus today. However, in order to talk to you about the Depop guidelines, I need to talk to you about the euthanasia guidelines, because that's really where it stems from. So we currently maintain 3 documents on the humane killing of animals. As I said, the final piece published April 1st. And we have a lot of other policies, documents, et cetera, that deal with humane killing, carcass disposal, and disaster planning and wellness issues. Why is this important for the AVMA? So these guidance documents are primarily geared towards the veterinary profession. They are used in a lot of other sectors of animal use, but they're primarily from the AVMA for veterinarians, and they touch every aspect of veterinary practice. They're used in voluntary animal care programs, whether they're companion animal, lab animal, food animal, or zoos and aquaria. And they're used as a regulatory and legal document. Federal, state, and local regulations have been known to stipulate AVMA's euthanasia guidelines. They are also cited in agency policy like the Public Health Service and USDA APHIS. They've been used in court cases, and primarily speaking about the guidelines for the euthanasia of animals, they've been considered a gold standard document, not just nationally but internationally. And we're striving to continue that high quality guidance with the guidelines for the humane slaughter of animals and the guidelines for the depopulation of animals. So, as I said, I got to hit a little bit on the guidelines for the euthanasia of animals and giving you some context for how we came to get the new guidance document we just published. The first edition of the euthanasia document was published in 1963. The current edition, the 2013 edition, is our 8th edition. And the document has changed dramatically over time. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but it is rather interesting to look at how it went from, I believe, a 9-page report to the 102 pages it is today. So we have quite a history in this document, and it's really expanded. Our membership is a great deal more diverse, and the species that we're covering continues to expand as well. Most recently adding a lot of things about invertebrates, right? So we continue to expand the document over time. And we want this to be data-based and perspective-balanced guidance and have it be highly influential in regulatory and business environments. So we have a process we've developed trying to achieve continual improvement of the document, and not only have it based on science, but to meet societal expectations for animal care over time. So society's expectations continue to change, and we want to continue to meet those expectations. The AVMA itself has made a commitment of resources to convening the panel and maintaining the production of the report. So future editions will continue to change, and some of you may know that we are actually in the process of a 2019 interim update. So that 2013 edition, with all of the panel members and working groups, over 80 individual members working on that report, including 3 technique groups and 8 species groups, as well as an ethicist. It was the first time we offered the opportunity for member comment on this document, and that panel continues to exist as a virtual entity, responding to inquiries and making recommendations for changes that need to be made, such as will happen with this interim update. Now, why is this history important for Depop? It's because this is the edition of the document where the panel made a deliberate separation of euthanasia, humane slaughter, and depopulation, and coined the term for the AVMA humane endings. So talking about killing as overarching with our humane endings kind of moniker, and breaking that out into these 3 different guidance documents. Now, coming into the guidelines for the depopulation of animals. So this is going to obviously be our first iteration of the document. And the focus of the document is on what should happen to animals once the decision to depopulate has been made. Now, this is going to be a little bit interesting. We'll talk about some of the new considerations beyond euthanasia and slaughter that the panel had to deal with. And then as we get to the end of my presentation, I'm going to give you a few concrete examples. I was happy that Dave is here to talk about some specific issues related to cattle. We have some other examples kind of getting to that story thing we heard about over lunch. It makes it easier for people to understand what the document is meant to be used for if we can provide them with examples of how this has happened in different species areas. So, new considerations or reasons for using rapid but less humane methods for killing. And Dave hit on some of these as well. Ending animal suffering, protecting wider populations, whether that's disease or something else, because of imminent risk, limitations of availability due to extreme conditions. So those two can go hand in hand. Our hurricane situations, wildfires, tornadoes, that sort of thing. Destruction or inaccessibility of equipment and personnel also play into this, and these are all things that we need to consider when talking about depop versus euthanasia. So the guidelines for the depopulation of animals state that when animals are designated for depopulation, they should be treated with respect, handled appropriately, and the depopulation process should limit the harms experienced by these animals as is practicable. However, in contrast to the previous guidelines, there's an acceptance that under very difficult circumstances, sometimes methods may need to be employed that are less humane than would be accepted as for euthanasia or a slaughter technique. And we really want to emphasize this. We've had some people come to us and suggest that AVMA should never endorse methods that would not be considered a form of euthanasia. Euthanasia, defined by the AVMA, a method of killing that minimizes pain, distress, and anxiety experienced by the animal prior to loss of consciousness and causes rapid loss of consciousness followed by cardiac or respiratory arrest and death. However, we may find ourselves in a situation where we do not have the luxury of performing euthanasia, but killing is still the best option for moving forward. These situations might include the things that I've listed here on the slide, and we hope that the examples that we're going to provide you, these real-life examples, will assist in understanding why we've come to that determination. So how did this document get created? There were 9 working groups, similar in manner to the euthanasia guidelines, each of them having 3 to 12 people. And an ethicist. We had 2 observing members, one of them from USDA and one from the National Institute of Health, Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. And I do want to mention here that USDA, we were very fortunate to receive a cooperative grant through a cooperative agreement from them to fund the panel actually coming in-house and meeting and discussing these issues in person. And when we're talking about a difficult subject like this, it is really important to have those face-to-face meetings and be able to talk about how difficult this is on our veterinary profession and those related to our profession. So these volunteers, their compassion for animals and that of the people who care for them compelled the association overall to take on compiling the guidance. We knew that we were going to need to create guidance for a variety of bad situations, covering a multitude of species, and so we set forth on that. We operated with more than 70 volunteers for this document, including those you see listed on the slide. And it took us just over 2 years between December 2015 and December 2017 to put this together. That draft, after December 2017, was presented to our membership for comment. It was out for a 90-day comment period. It took us a while to reconcile all those comments, and then was presented to the AVMA's Board of Directors in the spring of 2018. It was approved at that meeting and moved forward into the preparation for publication. This document ended up being 92 pages published. So those are JAVMA pages. So when I'm talking about the Word document we were looking at putting together for this, it was nearly 400, I think. So it's taken us a while, and I apologize to people for the delay, but we really wanted to make sure this document was done right. And so we spent a lot of time combing through the different chapters, trying to make sure we were being very consistent in the approach and the publication process. So we published this April 1st. We did have a webinar that you can view through AVMA's website. If you're a member, it's free. If you're a non-member, I believe it's $25 to download that and have access to it. And we also had some presentations at the Humane Ending Symposium this past November that are very relevant to this. As I mentioned, Dr. Dave Rethurst, among others, presented there on various emergency and depopulation-related issues. Those presentations are going to be loaded onto AVMA's new CE platform as well and will be available to you guys. So keep an eye out for those to pop up as well. So what is depopulation? This is the AVMA's definition. It is official now because this document was approved by the board. Depopulation refers to the rapid destruction of a population of animals in response to urgent circumstances with as much consideration given to the welfare of animals as practicable. For a method to be considered, it needs to be able to kill 100% of the target population. And that's no matter the size of that population. So we've had a lot of discussion about this too, especially as we get into companion animal, zoo, wildlife, exotic type of species. This document covers all of them. So when we're talking about a population, whatever that population may be, if it needs to be depopulated because of urgent circumstances, the method should be able to kill all of the animals in that group. Depopulation may employ techniques that are not considered euthanasia, would not meet the criteria for them. And urgent circumstances may include emergency situations such as the need for immediate disease control or a response to natural or man-made disasters. These guidelines are not applicable to precautionary killing, and it goes back to that definition about urgent circumstances. So when we say precautionary killing at AVMA, we're kind of talking about culling. So if we're talking about culling, this document doesn't apply. One of the things that we also want to be clear about from AVMA is that depopulation for us is trying to balance that need for rapid response and prevention of further devastation with the most humane method of death possible or available to us. We know that these are going to be dire situations, and past crises have taught us that when we do nothing in these situations, it can result in greater animal suffering and endanger animal caretakers and rescuers. Animal caretakers, whether those be farmers, whether those be employees in a laboratory animal setting, are very committed to the animals they serve. And when we don't have a plan for how to manage these dire situations, they will put themselves in danger to try to support those animals. So we need to have these plans in place. We strive, as always, to do the things that are going to reduce death overall, but if in the end humane killing is the method we need to go with in these situations, then we need to have a plan for that as well. Who is the document for? As I noted early on, the primary segment that this document is for is the veterinary profession. We're the American Veterinary Medical Association, so that's our primary audience. However, there are other members related to the veterinary profession and animal use sectors that this would be applicable to, and of course we know that they will be read widely and hopefully used as well. We also wanted to note, particularly for our veterinary profession, that this document is not limited to agriculture sectors. Overall, we know that animal ag talks and discusses these types of issues more than in other animal use sectors, but there could be instances, and have been instances, where companion animal practitioners, zoo and wildlife, laboratory animal medicine, aquatics, have had to come up with a plan to have emergency humane killing. So we'd like all of the sectors of veterinary medicine and the related animal use industries to be aware of the document and be making plans for how to handle emergency situations that are specific to their section of animal industry. When we expect this document to be used, we've been hitting on this a little bit as I've talked along, but depopulation is not to be deployed under ordinary circumstances. These are for extraordinary circumstances and during times of emergency. To provide best possible welfare for animals in these crisis situations, the AVMA supports advanced planning and support for implementation. That's really key, to have support for the implementation of the plan that's been drawn up once the decision to depopulate animals has been made. So before we get to a few examples, I'm going to go through how the panel classified methods for these guidelines. This is very different than what you see presented in the guidelines for the euthanasia of animals, where we have acceptable, acceptable with conditions, unacceptable. For depopulation, we have preferred, permitted in constrained circumstances, and not recommended. For the first category, preferred, these methods are given the highest priority and should be utilized preferentially when developing your emergency response plans and when circumstances allow reasonable implementation during the emergency. So the method that's included in the emergency plan ideally comes from this category. Many of the methods in this category are going to come from the guidelines for the euthanasia of animals or the guidelines for the humane slaughter of animals, but be adjusted for situational considerations. So for example, it may be an acceptable with conditions euthanasia technique, but the conditions have been waived or modified when it comes to the context of depopulation in an emergency. The second category is permitted in constrained circumstances. When our preferred methods become unavailable, one of the main options is to relax those conditions that would typically apply for the use of the euthanasia technique. Any technique in the category permitted in constrained circumstances should be seen as a necessary stopgap method and not a permanent solution at this time. Ultimately, the goal is to either develop the technique until it meets the definition of euthanasia or modify the conditions such that a preferred method can be used instead. So these methods are permitted only when the circumstances of the emergency are deemed to constrain the ability to reasonably implement a preferred method. And those constraints might include, but certainly not limited to, what you see up here on the slide: zoonotic disease risk response time. So as Dave was talking about, you have a certain number of hours to try to move through this population of animals. Could be human safety, could be the efficiency, how many resources or equipment you have available, access to the animals, disruption of infrastructure. We have seen those examples where we have roadways that have failed after hurricanes or flooding situations, and we can't get equipment in to where these animals are located. The third tier that the document covers is not recommended. These methods should be considered only when circumstances preclude the reasonable implementation of any of the first two tiers and when the risk of doing nothing is deemed likely to have a reasonable chance of resulting in significantly more animal suffering than that associated with the proposed technique. So if you were going to do nothing in the situation, allow the animals to die on their own or wait for a longer period to receive treatment, whatever that might be, would the suffering be more than what is proposed by the technique here? These methods are those last on the list and really require very extraordinary circumstances for their use to be considered. This is the most likely of the three categories to contain techniques which require skills that available personnel are not trained in. Inexpert personnel can represent a danger not only to increase suffering of animals, but may represent a danger to themselves, other people, and animals or the environment. The risks are relatively easy to imagine when you consider the use of firearms, particularly at a distance, poisons, or other dangerous substances. Just as steps need to be taken to ensure the availability of drugs, equipment, and other resources, trained personnel need to be prepared and supported to be available during emergencies. So while the guidelines urge veterinarians to consider taking uncomfortable actions rather than leave animals to their fate, there can also be danger for people who want to take an action when non-intervention may be the better choice. The technique selected should be the result of an analysis of the risks and benefits of each option for all the stakeholders involved, including those caretakers as well as the animals. Last, we have to note here that not recommended in this document does not mean unacceptable. This is a big difference between this document and the guidelines for the euthanasia of animals. If the panel on depopulation found a particular method or technique to be completely unacceptable under any circumstances, then it is explicitly stated that that technique or method is unacceptable. So now, having gone through that material, sort of where the guidelines came from, who they're intended for, how they should be used, I have a few examples for you. This horse is from a flood-affected area. So this is from the 2016 Louisiana floods. If you're familiar with horses or if you've been in flooding situations, and I know there's been some flooding in this upper Midwest moving to the west, these horses can develop dermatitis and cellulitis due to breaches in their skin's barriers and standing in these contaminated waters for long periods of time. So this particular horse stood in contaminated flood waters for about 3 days. And you see up there some of the complications that can come from this. There can also be other more serious complications for these animals that can lead to septic arthritis, lameness. They have increased chances of infections with bacteria or fungus. They can also be struck by fast things in the fast-moving water, including large items or very sharp items that can cause anything from an abrasion to a fracture. They're undergoing a lot of stress. They can aspirate water. They may be dehydrated, or they may have consumed contaminated food and water, leading to respiratory or digestive disease. So these animals are definitely in the area where we need to think about what our treatment options are for them, what our resources are towards treating these animals, what their quality of life is going to be like while we're doing those things, and whether they need to be destroyed at the time they come in. So this particular horse stood in those contaminated floodwaters for about 3 days, was brought in and was being treated and held for about 2 weeks when they found Pythium insidiosum on this horse, and the horse had to be destroyed at that point. So I have some other photos of this poor animal, and I have to say, having grown up with horses, these hit me hard. These are hard photos to look at, and the veterinarian who sent these to us, Dr. Fitzgerald Lee, had some other images that honestly I could not believe these horses recovered, but they did recover some horses that had nearly sloughed all of their skin. But I also have to think about, having been around horses my whole life, how long a process that must have been to recover and how their suffering may have been during that time. And so those are the items that I feel like we need to really consider for animals such as these. Briefly, another example is a fish example. So I kind of try to pull some that are not as well known to us. So in the early 2000s, there was an outbreak of spring viremia of carp, which is a contagious rhabdoviral disease in a commercial koi farm near North Carolina. This was the first identification of the disease in the U.S., so designated by the Secretary of Agriculture as a foreign animal disease, allowing APHIS to respond to the situation and call for depopulation as the course of action. So this facility had numerous earthen ponds containing several thousand ornamental carp or koi, and the water discharged from the facility was directly into a native stream in which several species of endangered fish were located. So this brought in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and now we have to take this into consideration as we think about depopulation method for these infected fish. So what they ended up doing was terminating the discharge from the earthen ponds and killing the fish with rotenone, adding that to the water. They netted the dead fish out of the water, buried them on site, and allowed the rotenone to break down with time and sunlight before reopening discharge from the facility. So Fish and Wildlife Services continued to monitor the spread of the virus in that stream or river that was having water discharged to it for 6 years after this event happened. This particular method here, based on our document, would be considered a permitted and constrained circumstance method. And I believe I'm butting up right at time. So you probably guys all have heard about foam in poultry, so that's why I left that one to the last in case we ran out of time. If you have questions that I am not able to answer here and you want to ask them later, you can email animalwelfare@avma.org. That email address comes to me as well as my other staff that help support the panels. And all three of the documents are available at avma.org/humane endings. And I know there are a couple people in this room who supported the panel, worked on the panel, and I'd like to say thank you very much. We can't do this work just as the staff. We rely on the volunteers to help us and be able to have real-life examples, be able to know what is something that we can do in reality. So we really appreciate your work on the document, and even if you weren't involved in that, your comments on the document when those drafts become available. So thank you for that.